Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is where we give you that shortcut, that essential insight into complex topics, making sure you're truly well informed without, drowning in data.
Exactly. We cut through the noise. And today, we're continuing our journey, digging deeper into a really significant conversation.
That's right. We're back with part two of our multi-part exploration of the really extensive interview with President Isaias Afwerki of Eritrea that was held just recently, July 19, 2025.
And it's such a detailed look, isn't it? His perspectives on these huge global and regional issues, it really gives you a unique window.
It absolutely does. Now, if you missed part one, we strongly recommend you hit pause and go back. We laid down some crucial groundwork there, essential context for what we're about to unpack today. It all builds.
Definitely. And just so you know, part three is also on its way very soon. This interview covers so much ground, and we really want to give it the time it deserves. No rushing through this.
Couldn't agree more. So for today, our mission, if you will, is to really pull out the key nuggets from the president's thoughts on, well, Africa's self-reliance, for one.
A huge
The
theme.
need for stability within nations and regional unity, and also those specific geopolitical pressures he sees in the Horn of Africa.
And we're sticking right to the source material, his conversation with Eritrean national media. The Q&A format really lets us see his thinking unfold.
Yeah, it's quite revealing. Okay, let's jump in. So right at the start, the president tackles this really foundational issue for Africa. Its history versus its future path. He doesn't shy away from the past.
Not at all. He clearly acknowledges the long history of injustices, the external interference. He even says, those responsible must be held accountable.
Right, but then there's this sharp turn, isn't there?
A very sharp pivot. He argues that, look, continuously engaging in a cycle of blame will neither yield results or move us forward. It's a call for a different approach.
More than just different, it feels like a fundamental reorientation.
It is. He shifts immediately from acknowledging that historical grievance, which is undeniable, to demanding proactive ownership from within Africa.
And he frames that question so directly.
He does. What have we done for ourselves? And more importantly, what must we now do? That's the key question for him.
So it's less about being victims of history
Yeah.
and more about being agents of the future. He's saying, yes, the past shaped us deeply, but dwelling only on that or waiting for outsiders to fix everything, that's paralysis.
It's about agency then.
Agency is the core insight here, I think. Agency, not just aid or constantly pointing fingers, that's what defines real sovereignty for Africa in his view. It changes the whole conversation with the rest of the world.
How so?
Well, it demands a partnership based on building capacity together, not just this endless cycle of dependency. It's about Africa taking control of its own path.
He uses that precise phrasing too, acknowledging the history first. Yes. Throughout its history, Africa has faced injustices and external interference at every stage. It is, therefore, understandable that we often lay the blame on outside forces. He gets it.
But immediately pivots to action.
Immediately. To that call for self-action, for Africa to drive its own transformation.
So what does this tell us, about the mindset of maybe some current African leaders and what it means for, say, global relations?
Well, I think it signals a real desire to break free from dependency, both economically and, maybe even more importantly, psychologically.
Right.
It suggests that while they fully see the impact of history and, current external factors, the real solutions, the strength, the sustainable development that has to come from within.
Moving from what was done to us to what we must do.
Exactly. That shift from blame to ownership is critical. It empowers action. And for global relations, it's a clear signal. Africa wants to engage as an equal, self-reliant partner.
Not just a recipient.
Not just a continent defined by its problems or its need for aid. It's a challenge to those old paternalistic ways of thinking that have often dominated North-South dialogues. It's about unlocking Africa's own potential from the inside out.
And that connects directly to his next point, which is quite striking, this contrast between Africa's immense resource wealth and its current economic state.
Yeah, the resource paradox. He points out Africa has an estimated 60% of the world's natural resources. 60%.
Huge number.
Yet it's still characterized by low socioeconomic development, stuck in what he calls a primary or nascent economic structure, mostly exporting raw materials.
And then he hits with that really powerful line.
The modern form of slavery line, yeah. To rely on aid instead of working, producing, and utilizing one's resources to achieve a higher standard of living is, in effect, a modern form of slavery.
That's incredibly strong language. He's not mincing words.
Not at all. And it's designed to be strong, I think. To cut
But
through the usual talk about aid and dependency, he's expressing this deep frustration with how the global system works.
he's challenging the whole concept of aid if it just leads to more dependency.
Right, and he gives that specific example, the HIV/AIDS aid from the U.S. He mentions the fear of possible deaths of many in Africa if those programs are shut down, and he asks, why should this be so?
Why should basic survival depend on external decisions when the continent itself is so rich?
Precisely, it's not just about the money. It's about the systemic vulnerability created by relying on these external lifelines. That phrase, modern form of slavery, it suggests that economic dependence—
And traps nations just as effectively.
Exactly. It traps them more effectively than physical chains, he seems to argue, because it erodes not just the economy, but the psychological will for self-determination. It's a direct challenge to the morality, even the effectiveness, of the current aid model.
And he really digs into the mechanics of this cycle, doesn't he? How it actually works.
He does. Raw materials go out, often under, exploitative conditions, undervalued.
And then they come back in as expensive finished goods.
Exactly. Value is created elsewhere, using African resources. It's extracted from Africa, not generated within it. That's the core of the problem he's outlining.
The Niger example really brings this home.
It's a stark case study. Niger, he says, is one of Africa's uranium-richest countries. France has benefited massively for the past 5 decades.
Yet Niger itself
Has not been able to build a single reactor to generate electricity for its people. Think about that. Decades of exporting uranium, but no nuclear power for its own citizens.
And he says it's not just Niger.
No, he mentions Burkina Faso, Mali, Senegal, Gabon, asking, despite abundant resources, what is the standard of living in West Africa? It underlines the pattern. Wealth flows out, poverty stays behind.
But it's not just about the raw materials being taken, is it? He identifies other blockages too.
Right, like the brain drain, the systematic depletion of intellectual capital. He says, skilled professionals and scholars are lured away with promises of better pay abroad.
Leaving their home countries without the very people needed to drive progress.
Precisely. You lose your engineers, your doctors, your scientists. How do you build a complex industrialized economy then?
And the DRC example, $25 trillion in untapped wealth.
$25 trillion, he says, untapped. Yet the people stay trapped in a cycle of poverty. It shows it's not just about having resources, it's about the systems or lack thereof to utilize them for the benefit of the population.
So material extraction, brain drain. And he also mentions a psychological harm.
Yes, and he stresses this point. He says the most subtle yet damaging psychological harm done to the continent is psychological. That aid and dependency breed resignation and debilitation.
So it saps the initiative, the drive.
That's the implication. It goes beyond economics. It affects the mindset, the belief in the possibility of self-reliance. And thinking long-term, the implications of this modern slavery for global relations, well, they're huge.
How so?
If Africa remains locked in this cycle, it just perpetuates this global imbalance, right? Where developed nations benefit disproportionately while African progress is held back. It breeds instability, poverty, missed opportunities for everyone, really. It prevents genuine, equitable global partnerships.
Which brings us to a perhaps surprising take from him, his view on the recent U.S. policy shifts, specifically Trump cutting aid programs.
Yeah, this is counterintuitive for many. He calls it a blessing in disguise.
A blessing. How?
His logic is that the cut will impel a quest for other alternatives. It will push Africa to think differently, to seek new solutions, and to build internal systems of support.
So like taking away crutches forces you to learn to walk on your own.
That seems to be the idea, a necessary shock, a catalyst. He thinks the short-term pain might actually lead to long-term structural strength and genuine self-reliance.
He's also quite critical of NGOs in this whole picture.
Very critical. He finds the sheer number of NGOs, which runs into 400 or 500 in some countries, to be disconcerting.
My disconcert.
He sees them often functioning as intermediaries of global powers. He argues that aid distribution itself has become a kind of business, and because too many benefit from its perpetuation, it's hard to dismantle.
So the aid industry itself has vested interests in maintaining the status quo.
That's his critique. It's fundamental. He believes this system, maybe unintentionally, perpetuates dependency instead of fostering real independent development.
So what's the alternative path forward, in his view?
Industrialization. Plain and simple. Africa's survival and prosperity, he says, depend on its ability to industrialize and elevate its position globally.
Which means?
It means building the capacity to process its own raw materials within Africa, adding value there. It means participating meaningfully in markets, domestic, regional, international, and crucially, raising the levels of education and professional skills across the board.
Sounds like a huge undertaking.
He acknowledges that. It is not an easy task, he says, but it is the only route for guaranteeing viable economic progress and status for future generations. It's the long, hard road, but he sees it as the only one that leads to genuine sovereignty.
And he's aware of the nuances, right? Like Washington looking at new ways to channel aid.
Yes, he mentions the talk about new bilateral agreements to redirect U.S.-side funds through other channels, ostensibly to mitigate the immediate human costs, the deaths and hunger that will otherwise ensue.
So he sees the cuts as a catalyst for self-reliance, but he's not blind to the immediate dangers.
Exactly. It shows he understands the complexities, but his core message remains firm. The ultimate goal, the only sustainable solution, is internal transformation and self-sufficiency, not just tweaking the mechanisms of external support. It's about building capacity, sovereign decision-making, real economic power from within.
Okay, so if self-reliance is the goal, he argues internal stability is the absolute foundation you need to build on.
Without a doubt. He states it very clearly. Internal turmoil is still one of Africa's most pressing challenges. It undermines everything else.
And his vision for tackling this.
It's focused on sovereignty and unity. Africa must prioritize and respect national sovereignty, nation building, and the pursuit of greater unity across the continent.
And he's very critical of divisive politics.
Extremely critical. He talks about divisive and discriminatory politics of polarization that whip up ethnic and other cleavages being rampant. He says they disrupt internal cohesion and stability. His message is blunt. The politics of division must end.
Does he think importing political models works?
No, he explicitly argues against simply copying Western political systems.
Yes.
He insists Africa must build governance systems that are rooted in its own realities, its own histories, culture, societies. Context matters.
And he sees external forces sometimes exploiting these divisions.
Yes, he calls it a well-worn strategy. Divide a country internally, pit one group against another, or fragment regions in order to maintain foreign influence.
Like using the threat of terrorism as a pretext.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He gives examples: Niger, Mali, Nigeria, Somalia, where the narrative of incipient terrorism is invoked, he suggests, to justify external interventions that might have other motives.
So the solution isn't external intervention in his view.
No, the solution is internal strength. Building strong, sovereign institutions, strengthening social cohesion, resisting division, and fostering inclusive citizenship to bring about national unity.
And this internal stability is crucial for Africa's role in the world.
It's the prerequisite. He argues that without resolving these internal crises, Africa can't play a meaningful role in the emerging new global order. Internal strength comes first, and that naturally leads to the next step.
Regional cooperation.
Precisely, building outwards from that internal stability.
He says pretty emphatically, no African nation can prosper in isolation.
Right, and that partnerships across neighborhoods, subregions, and the continent as a whole are essential. It's not optional, it's fundamental.
How does he see these partnerships working practically?
It's about creating synergies and enhanced capacities, pooling resources, coordinating policies, building infrastructure like transport, communication that actually connects countries, harmonizing trade rules, making it easier to work together.
He draws a parallel with China's transformation.
Yeah, pointing out that China was part of the Third World not long ago. He acknowledges the U.S. and Europe had their paths, but Africa needs its own distinct process for more rapid socioeconomic development, tailored to its unique situation.
Which leads back to self-reliance.
Absolutely. We have to reject handouts and rely on our own efforts, toil, and resilience. And again, the politics of fragmentation and relief dependency that have reigned in Africa must end. The core idea is that prosperity grows from within Africa and between African nations.
But again, internal issues first.
Yes, he stresses that meaningful development is impossible amidst internal social polarization and internecine conflict. Each country has to assess its own situation honestly, build on solid foundations of sovereign institutions, not on, warlords and militias.
So it's a layered approach. Fix things internally, then build strong regional partnerships.
Exactly. You need that comprehensive infrastructure, physical roads, yes, but also institutional strength, integrated economic programs connecting regions, fostering inclusive growth from the ground up. First, resolve the internal crises. Then Africa can truly shape global and regional systems rather than just being shaped by them. Internal strength as the launch pad for external influence. #3, U.S.-Eritrea relations and Horn of Africa geopolitics.
All right, let's shift gears a bit and look at his take on U.S.-Eritrea relations and the wider region. He poses a pretty direct question to Washington.
A very direct, almost challenging question. He asks if it's truly beyond Washington's capacity to adopt sound, forward-looking policies in this region. And then, why must the same flawed approaches be repeated time and again over the span of nearly 8 decades?
8 decades. That really frames it historically.
It does. He's pointing to a long pattern of what he sees as U.S. policy missteps in the Horn. He contrasts this with Eritrea's approach after independence in 1991.
What was their approach?
He says they made a deliberate and conscious decision to put the past behind us. They wanted to move on from the conflicts of the past. They sought constructive engagement.
Not looking for aid, he says.
Right. Not for subsidies, handouts, or protection, but based on the idea that past mistakes should be corrected and that new constructive relationships can be built. They wanted a relationship based on equality, mutual respect, not dependency.
But his account of recent administration sounds like, well, missed opportunities.
That's exactly how he frames it. He saw Trump's first term, starting 2016, as a potential opportunity for a substantive and open conversation. Eritrea reached out in 2017.
And the initial response?
Was, in fact, positive, he says, but unfortunately not sustained. He notes 3 years of President Trump's first term passed without progress. An open door that wasn't really walked through is the implication.
And the Biden years.
He describes those starkly. 4 years in which the situation deteriorated further, marked by an onslaught of sanctions, restrictions, threats, and overt hostility. Basically, an adversarial relationship where meaningful engagement wasn't really possible.
But despite all that,
He insists, our focus continues to be on the future and on restoring a functional and constructive relationship based on mutual respect and understanding. The desire to engage is still there, even after these setbacks, but maybe on different terms now.
Which brings us to the current context, maybe a potential second Trump term. Eritrea plans to re-engage?
Yes, he says they intend to resume their initiative, driven by the conviction that the fundamental flaws in U.S. regional policy must be addressed.
And it's not just about Eritrea's interests.
No, he makes that clear. It's not about narrow self-interest. It's about addressing what he calls destabilizing policies that harm the entire Horn of Africa and the broader region.
So what are these fundamental flaws he keeps mentioning? What does he point to?
Well, he first defines the region quite broadly. 4 interconnected geopolitical components: the Nile Basin, the Horn of Africa, the Red Sea, and the Gulf. He says it's crucial to critically examine the policies of Washington across these spheres over the last 30 years to identify the most fundamentally misguided policies.
Suggesting a U.S. approach that's fueled instability.
That seems to be his assessment. And he believes tackling this requires a concerted effort among neighboring countries and peoples. A collective regional voice pushing for Washington to rethink its approach.
And he's clear this isn't about asking for sympathy.
Very clear. Engagement is not born out of grievance. They're not appealing for empathy because sanctions were imposed. What's needed, he argues, is a fundamental shift in the U.S. policy framework itself, away from interventionism towards genuine partnership and respect for sovereignty.
He even gives a timeline for this.
He does, laying groundwork in 2025, then actively pursuing constructive engagement from 2026 to 2028.
While being aware of obstacles.
Yes, he acknowledges the negative influence of forces operating in our neighborhood who are actively lobbying against our cherished objectives, propagating distortions. He knows there are regional actors working against this kind of engagement.
And the U.S. isn't their only focus.
No, he lists Russia, China, the EU, India, Latin America, Japan, South Korea. He explicitly says engagement with the United States is one of several important priorities. It's a multi-directional foreign policy.
How does he see the current mood in Washington?
He describes it as being in a state of flux. He seems to expect a recalibration of priorities once other major global issues, Ukraine, China, etc., maybe become less all-consuming.
And that point about Ethiopian claims regarding sea access.
Yeah, that's significant. He flatly dismisses narratives that Washington supports Ethiopia's quest for maritime access as misleading narratives, quite divorced from the actual position held by the U.S.
So he's pushing back against regional rumor mongering, essentially.
It seems so. It shows he's acutely aware of how different stories are being spun within the region. Even as he talks about wanting to re-engage constructively with the U.S., it really underscores the diplomatic complexities involved. Hashtag 5, Ethiopian accusations, and the dangerous game of regional hegemony.
Okay, now turning to a really sensitive issue. The accusations Ethiopia has made against Eritrea. How does President Afwerki respond to those?
He responds very forcefully. He dismisses them as attempts to divert and externalize the country's domestic turmoil. He mentions official letters to the UN Secretary General, to heads of state,
And he calls them.
infantile and difficult to fathom. He says, fabricating and spreading cheap lies is both disgusting and unbecoming. He sees it purely as a calculated diversion, a preemptive way of avoiding responsibility for internal problems.
What internal problems does he point to?
He talks about a chasm between the euphoria and optimism that was created at the beginning, presumably referring to the initial period under Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, and the disillusionment that prevails now. He says the difference is striking.
Does he mention the Pretoria Agreement?
Yes, the peace deal for Tigray. He points to its non-implementation and mentions the stated rationale from some about needing to eliminate the Amhara Fano militia first. He's quite dismissive of the current prosperity government in Ethiopia, saying it's a waste of time to discuss whether it can really achieve its pronounced objectives, implying it's failing internally.
So the claims about Eritrea aligning with Tigray or Fano.
Are just tactics designed to deflect attention from self-induced internal crises, in his view. Pure deflection.
But he goes further than just calling them deflection, right? He talks about war preparations.
He does. He says, preparations for war are openly and blatantly evident. War has been declared in effect through insidious saber rattling.
Wow, declared in effect.
Yeah. And he calls lodging a complaint with the UN simultaneously a duplicitous and shameful act designed to cover up the actual declared war. He's accusing Ethiopia of trying to create a pretext internationally while actively preparing for conflict.
And the claims of external support for Ethiopia. France, U.S., UAE.
He dismisses that as propaganda meant to deceive the Ethiopian people. He insists this isn't just a fight between Eritrea and Ethiopia. It affects the wider region as a whole. Somalia, Kenya, South Sudan, Sudan, other Red Sea nations. The stakes are high for everyone.
So his core argument is Ethiopia's leadership is stirring up external conflict to distract from failures at home.
That's exactly the frame. He's trying to refocus attention back onto Ethiopia's internal challenges, arguing that the accusations against Eritrea are a dangerous smokescreen, risking wider regional instability.
Now, related to this regional tension is the idea of a sea corridor or port access. He addresses this directly.
Yes, and he says this concept has more profound implications that extend beyond casual discussion. It's not just a simple economic matter.
He brings up history again.
He does. A specific, chilling quote from World War II when it was declared that Eritrea does not serve our strategic interests.
Why is that parallel important?
It highlights this recurring theme from his perspective. External powers deciding the fate and strategic value of places like Eritrea based entirely on their own interests, ignoring the rights and sovereignty of the people living there. It speaks to a deep historical sensitivity about external manipulation.
And the specific talk about Djibouti's port revenues, offering Eritrea a cut via Saab.
He calls that offer a moral taboo for Eritrea. He states very clearly, we do not envy Djibouti's revenues and do not take actions to undermine or compete with Djibouti. He's flatly rejecting any suggestion that Eritrea is maneuvering for port access at Djibouti's expense.
What about the Somaliland angle?
He refers to reckless notions and covert messages aimed at the current Ethiopian administration so as to foment chaos involving Somaliland, again, implying behind-the-scenes troublemaking.
And he points to money playing a role.
A big role. Significant financial outlays influence peddling and outright purchases, he says, and adds, the source of these detrimental investments are well known.
Does he name the source?
He does. He lays blame directly on the UAE president, who specifically bears responsibility for what he calls the ludicrous idea of controlling a chain of ports from the Suez Canal to Dar es Salaam. He lists Jeddah, Hudada, Massawa, Assab, Djibouti, Berbera, Mogadishu, Lamu, Mombasa.
That's an enormous strategic ambition attributed to the UAE.
It is. He claims funds pouring into Ethiopia to buy influence and incite various crises are limitless, and mentions similar spending patterns impacting Kenya, the Sudan Civil War, Djibouti, Somaliland, and Yemen.
So his argument is that the conflict isn't really Ethiopia's agenda.
Not primarily. He says the accusations against Eritrea serve the agenda of new, self-proclaimed hegemons with their own agendas. He implicates not just the UAE, but also European countries, American intelligence agencies, and various other global, regional, and neighboring parties in this web of external interference.
It's a picture of a region being manipulated by multiple outside players.
A very complex and dangerous picture, and his call is for the peoples in the region to act wisely to prevent these actions from inculcating collective damage. It's a plea for regional awareness and unity against these external destabilizing forces. He sees the sea corridor issue and the funding as tools used by outsiders to fragment and control the region for their own benefit. #V, debunking warmongering claims and the path to enduring peace.
Okay, so given all these accusations and tensions, what's President Afwerki's direct response to claims that Eritrea is the one warmongering?
His response is absolute. We have no interest whatsoever in waging war. Full stop.
And he backs that up historically.
Yes, he says, if in the past 80 years Eritrea has ever entered into war, it has done so by compulsion, not by choice. He emphasizes never for expansion, never to seize land, never for ulterior motives, always defensive, compelled into it.
But they learned from those conflicts.
Definitely. He says Eritrea emerged from them with important lessons, implying they understand the true cost of war and value peace. But he adds a clear caveat. When and if war is brought to our doorsteps, we know how to defend ourselves.
So the accusations are baseless in his view.
Utterly. He says those making them are either ignorant of history or deliberately misrepresenting it. He calls the allegations not only unfounded, but infantile. He positions Eritrea firmly as a nation forced to defend itself, not one seeking conflict.
What about the rhetoric coming from Ethiopia? The saber rattling, as he calls it.
He addresses that head on. He quotes statements like, "We are 130 million strong," and asks rhetorically, but what does this mean? Whom do you intend to intimidate?
He mentions specific military boasts, too.
Yes, talk of drones being deployed to presumably obliterate designated targets, claims about newly procured weapons, including missiles with a range of 3,500 kilometers, tanks, and artillery. These aren't vague threats, they're specific claims about new, powerful weaponry.
And even specific invasion plans.
He mentions hearing intransigent pronouncements about plans to invade Assab, launch pincer assaults along the Gashbarka area, even advance through Sudan. He calls all of this, quite frankly, childish.
Childish, but dangerous.
Exactly. He also points to a network of propaganda institutions engaged in constant disinformation, twisting facts, misleading the public. He labels claimed diplomatic backing for Ethiopia as psychological warfare, meant to create a false sense of international support.
So, faced with all this, what's Eritrea's core message back?
It's simple and direct. All this is sheer folly. Our message remains simple. Stay put in your place, steer clear of this nonsense, abandon the infantile folly.
A warning, essentially.
The clear warning. He says this thinking risks dragging the Ethiopian people into a senseless and unwanted war, into a dangerous political dead end. And he loops back to his earlier point. These are ultimately diversionary ploys from key internal problems. He's concerned about the consequences, not just for Eritrea, but for the ordinary people of Ethiopia being led down a dangerous path.
All right, let's move to the final major theme. What President Afwerki calls the unfinished mission, achieving real regional integration.
Yes, despite all the conflict and external interference he describes, he comes back to this fundamental goal. Fostering integration at the regional and wider neighborhood levels remains a matter that we continuously strive for.
He sees it as a global trend, too.
He does. The prevailing trend is towards alliances or integration, he notes, pointing to examples like the EU or ASEAN. Nations realize they are stronger together.
But he's realistic about past attempts in Africa.
Very realistic and quite critical. He says past mechanisms like IGD, the OAU, the AU, all the mechanisms attempted in the past have failed.
Why did they fail, in his view?
He attributes it partly to Africa's own weaknesses, but also significantly to boundless external interferences that deliberately undermine unity efforts.
But failure isn't a reason to give up.
Quite the opposite. He says, the fact that it did not work is not a reason for despair. On the contrary, it engenders the impetus to persist with greater commitment. Failure fuels determination, in his view. It's a necessary goal.
Where should the focus be now?
On the immediate neighborhood first, he says, It is not feasible to proceed with the current situations in Sudan, Somalia, and Ethiopia. You have to stabilize the core region. He calls for an end to fragmentation, using that vivid image of Somalia being scattered like checker pieces.
And he connects this directly to Eritrea's own history.
Yes, this is a really important point. After independence in 1991, he says Eritrea's mission was not, in a sense, fully realized. Why? Because regional stability and mutual complementarity are important for the consolidation of our independence.
So Eritrea's own security depends on the region being stable and integrated.
That's exactly it. It's
Yeah.
not just idealism. It's seen as essential for their own national consolidation and long-term security. Regional integration is self-interest in the best sense.
He mentions lessons from Sudan's fragmentation.
Yes, how plots to fragment Sudan proliferated, efforts were wasted, and the secession of South Sudan was driven, he argues, by external interference and conspiracies. He asks again, pointedly, about the current war. Who is fueling this ongoing war? Implying external hands are still involved.
And Somalia's potential.
He sees huge potential. The role a united Somalia can play in the Horn of Africa is not insignificant. He views a stable, unified Somalia as a key partner for regional progress.
So how do you actually achieve this integration? What's the practical path?
It's not just about raising awareness, though he says that's essential in improving the awareness of the peoples is rising. Crucially, he insists, national institutions must also be built. Strong, functioning state structures are non-negotiable.
And Eritrea has offered practical help.
He gives a concrete example. Eritrea trained 10,000 Somali soldiers. The goal? To help create sovereign defense and security institutions in Somalia. Tangible support for state building.
So it's a continuous effort.
A relentless one. Regional complementarity is not a task that cannot be sidelined under any circumstances. It means working closely with neighbors, aligning with influential powers when objectives overlap constructively.
But not interfering internally.
That's the philosophy, he states. Not to meddle in the internal affairs of countries, but rather to assist in their efforts to correct the conditions that exacerbate internal problems. Supporting, not dictating.
And he ends on a note of conviction.
Absolute conviction. Despite all the challenges, the rising awareness is a strength, and ultimately, integration is an irreplaceable choice. There's no other viable path forward for the region, in his view.
Hashtag, tag, outro.
And that wraps up part 2 of our deep dive into President Isaias Afwerki's really comprehensive interview. We've covered a lot of ground: his strong call for African self-reliance, the deep frustrations with dependency, the absolute necessity he sees for internal stability and regional unity. Yeah, and his very candid views on U.S. policy, regional dynamics, the dangers of external interference, and these accusations of warmongering. It's a consistently argued perspective focused on sovereignty and African agency.
So just to kind of synthesize this for you, the listener, what's the big takeaway here?
I think the key is understanding this perspective that President Afwerki lays out. It's one that acknowledges the real weight of history, the injustices, but refuses to remain stuck there. It demands proactive steps from within Africa, building strong nations, working together regionally while simultaneously pushing back hard against external dependency and manipulation. It's a vision of self-determination, really.
A perspective we don't often hear presented this directly, perhaps.
Exactly. And it provides a crucial lens for understanding the motivations and strategies at play in a really complex, strategically vital part of the world.
Absolutely. Now remember, this was part 2. If you jumped in here, please do check out part 1 for the full picture. It really does set the stage.
And part 3 is coming your way very soon, where we'll bring this fascinating discussion to its conclusion.
Definitely stay tuned for that. So as we leave you today, here's something to think about, a question to mull over perhaps. Given President Afwerki's powerful emphasis on building sovereign institutions and achieving internal cohesion as the absolute foundation for development, what universal lessons might other regions grappling with similar challenges, instability, external pressures, historical grievances draw from this perspective? How might those lessons be applied to forge a path towards truly lasting peace and self-sustained prosperity?